All right, good to see everybody. Hope you're having a good day. We'll be in 2 Samuel. We'll pick up in chapter 15 this evening, so I'll let you turn over your Bibles there. Let a few more people trickle in here. Good to see you, Jenny. No Carrie tonight? Oh, he's coming. Okay, all right, good. You worried me. There's Carrie. Come on in, Carrie. I don't know why I'm calling you out specifically, but there's like 3 other people that walked in, and I just put you on the spot. All right, we'll go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Like I said, we'll be in 2 Samuel 15. But yeah, to begin with, join me in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for this day and for all the blessings you've given us, and for this time that we're able to set apart in our schedules to study and learn more about you, and to hopefully edify one another and build one another up as we get a break from our crazy schedules. And just pray that you continue to be with this group here and help us to draw near to you and to draw near to one another. And we pray for those that are unable to attend this evening. We know that we got several that are sick and maybe traveling as well, God. And we just pray particularly that you be with David King as he's recovering from surgery, and also others that might have ailments, that they make a recovery so that they can be back with us too. Just thank you so much for your son Jesus, and it's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right, so as I said, 2 Samuel chapter 15 through 16, and I just want to remind us of this prophecy given by the prophet Nathan after David commits his sin with Bathsheba, and he's given him that story and tells David, the story's about you. You're the man that's done this, and he's caught by not only the Lord, but the Lord's prophet, and he's being rebuked, and he tells him the consequences. And so it's kind of interesting, is David forgiven by God for for the sins he committed against Bathsheba, against Uriah the Hittite? Is he forgiven for that? Right. Does that mean that there are 0 consequences for the sin? Right. So that's what we kind of got to separate sometimes, even as Christians today, right? That just because I'm forgiven of my sins, even in interpersonal relationships, just because somebody forgives me does not necessarily mean now there's 0 consequences, right? And so the consequences are described to us by Nathan. In verse 10, he says, "Therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun." It's at that point David says, "I've sinned." And there's a contrast already there between David and Saul. I think Saul, when we read about him, he uses those words, "I've sinned," but he says it to avoid consequences. David has just been told the consequences, and he repents, not expecting the consequences to be reversed, but expecting them to be fulfilled, and yet he still repents. And so in either case, I just want this to be in the back of our minds, because it really sets the tone for what we read all the way through, definitely chapter 18, but even through like chapter 20. And everything that we read about Absalom, I believe, can really be traced back to this prophecy, and therefore David's big sin, his big mistake that he committed with Bathsheba and against Uriah the Hittite. And so also, just to recap, we begin to see these consequences playing out, and we begin to see David, because he compromised and allowed personal injustice to creep into his life, right? He acted in an unjust way against Uriah the Hittite. I think that he develops kind of this weak spot. Maybe he would feel like a hypocrite if he judges his own family. And so that's where we read about in chapter 13, this sin that Amnon commits against Tamar. If you weren't here, you can look that up in chapter 13, or I'm sure that you remember. It's a pretty famous section of 2 Samuel where Amnon essentially, he rapes Tamar. And what does David do about that, right? Nothing. He's just angry about it, right? And I think that we can see how he kind of gets to this point where he's angry but not willing to do anything, because you could see him struggling maybe with, how can I judge somebody when I got this glaring sin that I committed in my past Not that that excuses David's inaction, but we can see how these things are developing. And it's this warning that if I allow sin in my life, if I allow injustice into my own life and I'm participating in those things, man, it affects more than just my life. It might affect how I discipline people that are under my authority in the future. And the tragedy of this, you might say, well, he's acting mercifully towards Amnon, but who is it that suffers ultimately because of David's inaction? It's Tamar, right? And so you have to think about the victims involved when we are turning to, or choosing to kind of turn the other way and take a blind eye to things. And so because of that, now you have this Absalom, David's son. My clicker's not going. There you go. You have Absalom who, because of David's inaction, he says, you know what, I'll take care of this. And he waits 2 full years for his opportunity. And finally, he's able to, he just basically murders Amnon. There wasn't war or anything going on like that. He just found an opportunity, essentially, and he murders Amnon. And of course, this really upsets David. Absalom kind of goes into exile for a little bit, and Joab kind of comes up with a scheme that we read about in chapter 14 that eventually leads to Absalom being able to come back. And so that's kind of where we left off. But what I want us to notice as well is that Absalom, I think because of all this, he's really emboldened, right? So that's why discipline is so important in our homes, right? Just to use this as an illustration, because if your kids see that one of your siblings got away with doing something that's typically wrong, what's that going to teach them? What's that going to do for them? Right? It's going to embolden them maybe to do the same thing. They'll think, well, because so-and-so got away with this, maybe I can get away with this. And then if they do get away with it, what's that going to teach them for the next time? Okay, I actually can get away with this. And you can see how things can get out of hand really quickly. And I think this is what's going on in David's own house, and it's eventually going to spill over into the nation, where because David has this tendency to kind of turn the other way when his children do something wrong, I think Absalom is emboldened by this. I think he feels like he can do what he wants without really any serious consequences. He knows that his dad's not going to have him killed or charge him with treason because he saw Amnon get away with what Amnon got away with. And so in 2 Samuel 14, I find Absalom as he's returned to Jerusalem, but he still hasn't been allowed to enter the presence of the king. I think the text says for about 2 years in chapter 14. And finally, he's pleading with Joab to give him an opportunity to approach his father David. And finally, Joab kind of breaks down and allows for that to happen. And, David shows and kind of restores favor towards Absalom. But I find Absalom's attitude kind of interesting in one of the statements that he makes. In verse 32, he says, "Therefore, let me go into the presence of the king, and if there's guilt in me, let him put me to death." And then, of course, says Joab let that happen. He goes in, he bows before the king, and it says that the king kissed Absalom. If there's one thing Absalom knows about his dad, or has learned about his dad at this point, for whatever reason, he doesn't like conflict. He doesn't like particularly internal conflict, and he's not going to kill one of his own sons. I think that's something that Absalom is absolutely aware of. And so he's gotten away with this murder towards Amnon, and we can talk about, Amnon probably deserved for that to happen, but the way that Absalom went about it wasn't right. And now he's gotten away with this, and I think it's just going to embolden him further. In fact, we know that that's what happens. And so that's where chapter 15, we begin to see Absalom's rebellion really picking up pace. And again, I think it's because of what Absalom saw Amnon get away with, what Absalom himself has already gotten away with. And so we'll pick up in verse 1, and I'll read verses 1 through 10, actually. It says, "After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, 'From what city are you?' And when he said, 'Your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel,' Absalom would say to him, 'See, your claims are good and right, and there is no man designated by the king to hear you.' Then Absalom would say, 'Oh, that I were judge in the land, Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice. Whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king of judgment, or the king for judgment. And so Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And at the end of the 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived in Geshur and Aram, saying, 'If the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord.' The king said to him, 'Go in peace.' And so he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, 'As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron.'" So one question I want to ask, I think that, first of all, if there's one word we can use to describe Absalom, it's that he's very shrewd. Absalom is not a stupid individual. And so what are some things that kind of jump out to you from a worldly point of view that are quite shrewd on Absalom's part? In other words, how does he kind of slowly begin to get a foothold in this conspiracy that he has brought about against David? What are some things that he does here to kind of sway the people to his side? Yeah, right. So he's kind of treating them like equals, isn't he? They pay homage to him, and he kind of just treats them like they're on his level, right? What else does he do? Go ahead. Yeah, no, you're good. Yeah.
And it seems like he's offering what the people want is prison or death or punishment for someone doing something against you.
Right, so he's basically implying I can do it better than David is, right?
And by offering to charge something crime or convict their enemies, I mean, that alone, taking the entire village.
Yeah. Nothing gets people more excited like convincing them that if they're in power, the court systems will work in a way that is just exactly pleasing to whatever it is that you want. I think we see some of that. What else do you see Absalom doing to kind of sway the people in his direction? Yeah. No, I think you're right about that, and I think that maybe Absalom has, or maybe a way to put this is David has made this a very easy argument for Absalom to make. We see how he handled his own household. We can only imagine how maybe he handled, other court hearings. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, I think that nails it on the head. And I think David's really created a monster at this point and has made it easy for him to do this. There's obviously some level of dissatisfaction that Absalom's able to exploit at this point in time. I think one of the first things he does is he kind of beefs up his image, doesn't he? I mean, right when he's back in the good graces of David, he gets horses, he gets chariots, he gets 50 men, to lead him along the way. And so, wow, this is, obviously Absalom's he's back in good standing in the kingdom of Israel again. And he's got a lot of power, and there's a lot of pomp and circumstance there. And then there's just a few more things. You all pretty much touched on them. I think he's working, first of all, very diligently to sway the people to his side. It says in verse 2, Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And so he's treating people like they're a priority. He's rising early in the morning, first person there, and whoever has a problem that they're bringing to a gate, man, he's the first one that they're going to see there. And so this is something he's working tirelessly doing, perhaps for 4 years, because in verse 7 it said at the end of 4 years, right? So this isn't something that happens just like that. This is the product of a lot of groundwork that Absalom is laying and doing so diligently. I want you to notice in verse 3, he validates and empathizes the complaints. And I think this is where it gets to the realm of he's probably telling people what they want to hear a little bit. There wasn't a single complaint. I think the way that it's described almost lends itself to this idea that when Absalom heard a complaint, it doesn't matter what it was. I don't think he was probably too bothered by the details. The answer he was going to say to him is, you know what, that's a really good complaint. And, I would love to do something about it, but unfortunately, I'm not the king. Otherwise, if I were the king, here's what I would do, right? And kind of planting these seeds, and it's very shrewd, because nobody can accuse Absalom at this point of trying to usurp the throne, can they? He's just kind of throwing it out there. Look, if it were me, this is what I would do. Unfortunately, I'm not the king. And kind of planting this idea and kind of bringing people along, I think, and bringing them around to this idea of Absalom being king, and maybe getting people to wish, man, I wish Absalom was in charge because I wouldn't have this problem anymore. He would solve this problem of mine. And then, again, as we already talked about, as Larry kind of brought out, I think that David probably had made this an easy argument for Absalom to make, but I think he's also kind of exacerbating whatever dissatisfaction was there, which is kind of a typical thing, right? When you're wanting to sow discord and create dissension and to gain power, you're going to exploit any little level of dissatisfaction somebody has and kind of aggravate that. Go ahead, Margaret. At the end of 40 years, well, that's interesting. I don't know about that. I'll have to look. Oh, yeah, there is a Septuagint footnote there. I don't know about that. That I think would probably be a what's the word I'm looking for? A variant. But I would imagine that the correct translation of that would be 4, because 40 years, that seems kind of crazy. I could be wrong about that, but yeah. So that's probably a scribal error is, I guess, the word I'm looking for. That's probably what that is. But I'll have to look at that. That's interesting. I didn't notice that before studying. But as Margaret pointed out, he's making the commoners feel like equals as well. But then notice verses 7 through 10, right? Kind of has this religious veneer. I have to go to Hebron and make a vow, and or at least keep this vow or fulfill this vow that I made several years ago after God brought me back to Jerusalem from Geshur. And so you can kind of see, I think Ronnie hit the nail on the head. He's being a politician, isn't he? And I think the words are interesting in verse 6. It's successful. In verse 6, it says, Absalom did to all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And so I guess the question I want to ask, is there any practical application here? Does this offer any lessons for us today as God's people? Okay. Pay close attention to what people are saying. Yep. Yeah. Yep. No, that's true. That people tend to put themselves in a good light, and we got to be careful of how much we trust that. What else? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that Absalom's kind of the new Saul. When you talk about Saul, what did he have going for him from a worldly perspective? I mean, he was rich. He was head and shoulders taller than everybody else. He was, the attractive choice, wasn't he? I think it's interesting in chapter 14, we didn't look at this, but in chapter 14, verse 25, it says, Now in all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. from a worldly standpoint, Absalom has all the right stuff. And I think another reason that the red flag should go up, though, is that Absalom, he's telling them everything that they want to hear, like a true politician, right? And that's not to say that there's not some merit to the things and the points that he's making, but it's very easy to criticize a position that you've never actually worked in before, right? If I was king, I would do all the hard things, I would make the hard judgments, I would do the right thing. That's easy to say when you haven't been in that position before. That's another thing when you're actually in those shoes. And I think that we just see an eagerness on behalf of the rest of Israel to kind of buy into that and to just kind of naively listen and trust everything that's being said because it is so pleasing to hear. I think there's definitely a warning for God's people. And when you look at him doing things to kind of get on the same level as the commoner, it's like when you look at the political realm, right? It seems like every governor, president, they have some political ad where they're walking with a farmer, right? And like wearing the farmer's hat, wearing some Carhartt and some dirty boots. It's like, oh yeah, see this guy, he's just like, he's like the rest of us, right? I mean, we still see this going on to this day, but there's not really any substance to Absalom. And that's not to say that David was perfect. We see that he made some serious mistakes, but I think that we see that Absalom isn't a better option as the story goes on. Go ahead, Amy. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that I would say David's at fault. I mean, but I don't think that that the people are justified in going after Absalom, though. At the same time, I think that it's going to a worse option, I guess, a bad solution to this problem that they're dealing with in David. And I think that you see that unfold. And the type of person that Absalom becomes, the first thing that he ends up doing is sleeping with all of David's concubines. Yeah, okay. I think if there's anything that would be an indication to the people that maybe they made a mistake right away, it's when Absalom does that. That's the first decision he makes. And he's this guy that wants to assert his power in crude ways. But yeah, I think that's a great point. That David definitely... he's kind of created this monster and created this problem and created the occasion and opportunity for something like this to happen. And so Absalom, he's just gathering more and more people on his side as he kind of sends these messages out and prepares people for this to happen. In verse 12, kind of something to put in the back of your minds, it talks about how one of David's counselors, and it ends up I think being one of his best counselors, at least at this point in time. It was somebody that David had a high level of respect for. His name's Ahithophel, and he's somebody that joins this Absalom conspiracy. And so in verse 13 it says, a messenger came to David saying, the hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom. And David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly, and bring down ruin on us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword. The king's servant said to the king, behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king decides. And so the king went out, and all his household after him, and the king left 10 concubines to keep the house. And the king went out, and all the people after him, and they halted at the last house. So what do you guys think of, first of all, just David's response here? Right when he receives message that the hearts of the people are with Absalom, his first instinct is to flee. What do you guys think about that? Does this seem like the David that we were first introduced to? Very different, isn't it? Again, when I see David acting like this, I can't help but think of that speech that he gave when he's going out to face Goliath. Who's this uncircumcised Philistine? And he rallies the troops, and he goes in and takes Goliath down, and leads the people in this epic defeat of the Philistines. And now his first instinct is to flee. And so I guess, why do you think that is? Why is that his first instinct? Go ahead, Larry.
I feel because of his sin, he feels defeated, and he's afraid of sinning against God again, even more.
Yeah.
And so he chose to just do whatever it took to not.
Yeah, so maybe he's feeling like he's out of favor with God, and maybe didn't have the favor that he had when he was marching against Goliath. It's his son, right? And we've seen already he shows a lot of partiality towards his sons, doesn't he? And it's one thing to march against the Philistines, another to go on offense against your own child, right? What else do you guys think? I do wonder if maybe there's a hint in what David says. He says, "Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly, and bring down ruin on us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword." I want to remind you for a minute, what is it that Nathan told David would happen as consequence? What did he tell him? Sword shall not depart. And I just can't help but wonder if that prophecy is in the back of David's mind when all of this is unfolding. Really, what does David know as far as the specifics of how all this will work out? I mean, we go back to the covenant that was made to David and how his kingdom will be established forever. But what bearing does that have on these current events? Is there anything about that covenant that God made with David in chapter 7 that if David's king is taken from his hands, given to Absalom, that God couldn't still fulfill, maybe in Absalom? And I have to wonder if David is maybe just looking and saying, maybe this is how God's planned it. Maybe this is what Nathan meant when he said the sword shall not depart from you, and not really knowing whether or not that means, am I still going to be in charge of this kingdom, or maybe God will carry on this covenant through my son Absalom. I think there's a lot of tension here. There's a lot that's up in the air when it comes to what is David's ultimate outcome. He knows what will happen of his house, the house of David. He knows what will happen of his kingdom. It'll be carried on by one of his sons. I think that he understands that. But what is David's specific role in God's plan now concerning whether or not he's still king, or who this kingdom belongs to within the house of David? And so I think it's very interesting if you think about how Saul kind of responded to the rise of David compared to how David's responding to the possible rise of Absalom. Not to make David, perfect in comparison to Saul, but I think there's something to that where Saul's initial reaction, it seemed, was always to dig his heels in, to go on offense. And David, almost sometimes to a fault at this point in his life, kind of has this attitude where, let's just wait and see how this plays out. And I wonder if some of that has to do with this prophecy that was given by Nathan. And he's saying, okay, I can see how this is lining up, how this can be a fulfillment of what was prophesied to him through Nathan. And of course, I think it is a fulfillment of what Nathan prophesied to him. Any other thoughts as far as why David responded this way? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I think there's something to that. Yeah, anyways, I don't have the exact answer to that, why we have such a stark contrast between the David that we see versus Goliath and the David we now read about as his son is rebelling against him. But I do think it's interesting. And so David's, again, first reaction is to flee, and so he's kind of gathering everybody up. And I think it's very interesting when you look at David, and as he is fleeing, basically in chapters 15 and 16, you just have this series of meetings and these interactions with individuals. And I think the first several interactions that we see, we're getting insight into the fact that David still has a lot of support around him. This isn't quite the same as when he first went off on his own as he was fleeing from Saul, where he basically, he was just pretty much totally alone, wasn't he? Now he's leaving the city of David. He has this inner circle of people who are loyal to him. And for starters, we read about this man named Ittai, and apparently this guy hadn't been with David very long, and David is trying to encourage him and tell him, look, you should just go back. You have hardly been with me very long at all, and why would you want to go through all this trouble of following me? Just go back, serve my son. And it's almost like he's saying, I won't hold it against you. Like you're free to go and do that, and I wouldn't blame you for doing that at all. In verse 21, you have this impressive response from Ittai. It says in verse 21, Ittai answered the king, as the Lord lives, and as my Lord the king lives, wherever my Lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be. And David said to Ittai, go then, pass on. And so Ittai the Gittite passed on with all his men and all the little ones who were with them. And so that's just one example of an individual who is just going to be fiercely loyal to David no matter where it leads. And then in the next section of this chapter, you read that David still has the support of the priests. In verse 24, it says, Abiathar came up, and behold, Zadok came also with all the Levites, bearing the ark of the covenant of God, and they set down the ark of God until the people had all passed out of the city. Now David tells them that they need to stay there, that is the place where you worship God. But now David has people that are within this kingdom. They're trusted confidants of his that can give him reliable intel that he can count on. And so he still has all of the priests that are on his side and in support of him and working for him within the kingdom of Israel. And then you read about one of David's friends, and this is kind of interesting because this is right on the heels of when David finds out about Ahithophel. And when David finds out that Ahithophel is on Absalom's side in verse 31, it says it was told David, and then as you drop down, it says he reacted like this, O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. So he knows, man, this is a very wise person that Absalom has on his side, and I think that he's worried about it. Well, the very next person that we read about is this man Hushai in verse 32, who comes running up over the hill, and it says that he came to meet with him, his coat torn and dirt on his head. But he tells Hushai to basically go and work within Absalom's inner circle, and he's going to be this person that provides intel for him as well and tries to kind of sway Absalom into following bad advice, actually. And so verse 37, it says, Hushai, David's friend, came into the city just as Absalom was entering Jerusalem. And so it's very interesting to me as you read about all the bad things that are happening, David still has support. He has support from individuals, but I think more importantly than that, this is support that God is still giving to David. And I think that's a very interesting concept that while David is being judged, he's still being supported and I think provided for by God. The other thing that stands out to me as well is that I think we see, again, I don't want to make a hero over David, but I'm actually, in chapters 15 and 16, I'm really impressed by David. Because I think that we still see David having a great amount of faith during this time in his life. I want you to put yourself in David's shoes. Have you ever had a day as bad as the day that David is having in this chapter? Anybody? Probably not, right? Your son has taken everything from you, turned the entire kingdom against you. Your most trusted counselor has betrayed you. You're having to leave your own home, your own house. It says that he's grieving when he's leaving. And all these things are going on in the midst of that, and it's kind of being piled on. But the first thing that stands out to me about David, and where I think that we see David's faith, is he is different from what we read at the beginning of Samuel. So remember at the beginning of Samuel, when they're going out to battle against the Philistines, what is it that they bring out and they know that if we have this thing, we're going to win this battle? What did they bring out? They brought out the ark, right? And what happened? They won the battle and it was awesome, right? No, they lost and the ark is taken away from them and everybody's shocked. How could this happen? In the story there, the moral of the story is you need to trust God more than you trust these relics, more than you trust God's furniture. And you see, David doesn't make that same mistake, does he? He doesn't think, oh, if I take this ark with me wherever I run to, if I take it to the other side of the Jordan, then I'll be okay because I have the ark. And that seems like that's kind of the mentality of the people that are with him. They're thinking, David, we're with you. And we're going to bring the ark with you so that, God will give us victory. And David realizes it's not about seeking God's furniture. What is he seeking in verse 25? It says, the king said to Zadok, carry the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see both it and his dwelling place. So is it about the ark to David? Is it about some relic? No, what's it about? It's about God's favor, whether or not he is in good standing with God. And he says, if that is the case with God, if I still find favor from him, he'll bring me back. I'll be okay. And then I think you see in verse 26 how even though all this has got to be troubling to David, we know that it is. There's likely psalms that are written during this period of his life. He says in verse 26, I have no pleasure, or in verse 26 he says, if he says, I have no pleasure in you, behold, here I am. Let him do to me what seems good to him. And I think that we found a similar statement by Joab when they're going out to battle, and Joab doesn't know how the battle is going to turn out, and he says, you know what, we're just going to do what we know we need to do, and we're going to let God do what's good to him. And I think that's the height of faith, isn't it? How many people in David's situation would panic about the outcome, would be anxious over the results, would be trying to imagine every way, the horrible way, and the worst possible case scenario, and yet that seems like that's not where David's allowing his mind to go at this time. That what he's resting in is whatever is good to him, that's okay, right? He says, here I am, let him do to me what seems good to him. And I can't help but wonder again if that gets back to that sin with Bathsheba and him recognizing that all of this really is a direct result of this mistake that he had made at this point several years in the past, and just accepting the consequences that now come his way. And so I think that's really a tremendous evidence of his faith. But then also, I want us to see what happens when he finds out about Ahithophel. And so he gets this bad news about this counselor, who, by the way, later on in the chapter 16, I think it is, it tells us that Absalom and David, that when they heard Ahithophel speak, it was like hearing God's words. It was that important to them. And go ahead, Amy, before I keep going. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. So again, another example of weird family ties going on as well. But what are the two things that happen right after David finds out about this? What's the thing that David does? Read in at the end of verse 31 what David does after he finds out about this. It doesn't say what he does. We infer it's what he's doing based off of what he says. But what does he do? What does he do? He prays. So he finds out about this horrible news. Again, this is just one more thing on top of a really bad day, right? I mean, the day is already horrible, and you find out that, this weird family relationship that you have with this guy, but also this really trusted counselor that you have in your inner circle, seemingly somebody that David thought he could count on, is no longer on your side, and so the first thing he does is he prays. How many of us would respond if we're in David's shoes with all that's going on, all the people that are coming and going from him, wanting to know what they're going to do and what's going to happen next? How many of us just stop and we pray right there in the moment? And that's what David does. He says, "Oh Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Now it's interesting, David thought that if he was going to beat Ahithophel and the counsel that he was offering Absalom, that God had to turn it into foolishness. That's not what happens, but I do think that God answers David's prayer, doesn't he? What's the answer to David's prayer? It's right after he prays it, literally right after. Who do we read about? Hushai. Here comes Hushai. And how does it describe him? He's a friend of David, right? And so this is very interesting when you have, I think we can't relate to the specifics of David's story. None of us are kings and all of that. But I think we can relate in general to times in our lives where bad things happen, and that's where you find out what your relationships are really made of, right? And I can think in my own life, there are times in my life where bad things have happened, and I've discovered new relationships, new friendships I can count on, like the friendship that David has with Ittai, right? This was a new person, and he just is saying, David, I'm going to be there for you, even though you haven't known me for very long. It's also a time, though, where you can lose friendships, isn't it? We've had times like that in our lives where the Ahithophels, the people we thought were in our corner, all of a sudden they betray us and they're on the side of the enemy, right? But we also go through times where old friendships, right, we realize just how trustworthy those friendships are. And so while all these bad things are going on, I think that there's a lot of good things going on as well. Even though David's being judged, he has this support that's given him. And again, I'm impressed by David's faith at this point in his life. I think it's a contrast to when, the first time he was on the run. I think that when you read about David, there's certainly some faith that is shown during that time in his life. But I think that you look at David, and it was definitely a lot more hectic. Here you have a David that's been through this before, and the fact that he's able to think and come up with ideas of what he can do and how they can kind of plan for this and a strategy going forward, I think is really impressive to me, given all the mistakes David has made. Those are things that are impressive to me. Go ahead, Janice.
I also see is that David is more humble.
Mm-hmm.
He's very humble.
Yes, yeah.
And you can see that with his behavior about Absalom as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's true, yeah. David's enemies. This is chapter 16. So you read about David's friendships and close relationships that he has in chapter 15. In chapter 16, it kind of gives us a list of interactions with David's enemies. And I'll put kind of an asterisk next to Ziba's name. When you read about Ziba, it's if you don't recall, Ziba was Mephibosheth's servant. And Mephibosheth is the last remaining descendant of Saul, and he was lame in his legs, and David took care of him, restored all Saul's property and wealth to Mephibosheth, and Ziba was a servant of Mephibosheth. And so here comes Ziba, and he's bringing him, all this bread and food and wine and provisions and donkeys to ride on, and providing this for David. And David asks, "Where's Mephibosheth?" And it's kind of interesting, the story that Ziba gives him for why Mephibosheth isn't there. In verse 3 it says, "Behold, he remains in Jerusalem, for he said, 'Today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father.' And then the king said to Ziba, 'Behold, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours.' And Ziba said, 'I pay homage. Let me ever find favor in your sight, my lord the king.'" Now you don't think anything of that, and I think that when it comes down to it, Ziba was on David's side. But a few chapters later, in chapter 19, David comes back to Jerusalem. He's talking with Mephibosheth, and he says, "Mephibosheth, why didn't you come with me?" And first of all, when David first sees Mephibosheth, his hair is totally grown and unkept, his beard is untrimmed, and the way the text describes him, it's like he hasn't been taken care of. And basically, Mephibosheth, his story is that Ziba just kind of abandoned me. And of course, David had already given all his possessions to Ziba, and so David says, "Well, half will go to Mephibosheth, half will go to Ziba." And Mephibosheth says, "Look, I don't care, he can have it all, it doesn't matter." And I think that what we're to take away from that is that Ziba was probably lying and exploiting David during a low time in his life, hoping to gain a little bit of power, a little bit of security, a little bit of financial security as well. And so this is the first person that we read about in chapter 16. But the most famous story we have is the story with Shammai. And we're almost out of time, unfortunately. But I'll just read verses 5 through 14, and maybe we can end here. It says, "When King David came to Bahurim, there came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shammai, the son of Gera. And as he came, he cursed continually, and he threw stones at David, and all the servants of King David, and all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. And Shammai said as he cursed, 'Get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. And the Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood.' Then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, 'Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take off his head.' But the king said, 'What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, Curse David, who then shall say, Why have you done so?' And David said to Abishai and to all his servants, 'Behold, my own son seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjamite leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look on the wrong done to me, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today.'" And so he lets Shammai go. We could spend a lot of time talking about applications. We don't really have time for that. I think the applications are obvious. They've been made before. Don't pull a Shammai, right? Don't pronounce judgment before things have really played out. Have your opinions, that's one thing, but be careful in how you voice them. And we're impressed by David focusing on really what the bigger problem is. And so I won't get into that. We don't really have time. And so I'll just summarize, Ahithophel, right? He's this traitor as well that betrays David. He's the one that gives Absalom the advice to sleep with all his concubines, and we know that story as well. And so I guess the last point that I want to make is that while we see the wickedness of Absalom, of these traitorous people in his life, and Absalom's going to be held accountable for that, let's back up again and ask, why is all this happening? Why is Absalom risen to power? It's because David's sin, but also it's fulfillment of God's word, isn't it? That's a very interesting concept. You have this wickedness that men are committing, that they're going to be held accountable for, but at the same time, you have fulfillment of God's word. But we see that in the New Testament too, don't we? When Jesus is crucified and Peter makes the point that this was according to God's foreknowledge that he was delivered up, but that these people were lawless and they were wicked men that killed Jesus. We see that in the New Testament as well. The last point I want to make, though, and I think the thing that stands out to me in this section of Samuel, as we consider that passage that's made in this prophecy about David from Nathan, I think we can safely assume that these things are happening as an act of judgment against David, right? Amen to that? This is an act of judgment that is happening to David. When Absalom sleeps with his wives in broad daylight, I think that's something that Nathan told him in kind of an indirect way would happen. In chapter 12 and verse 11, he says, "Behold, I'll raise up evil against you out of your own house. I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun." Right? So this was judgment being carried out against David. And yet, did God take care of David during this period of judgment in his life? Those two things sound antithetical, don't they? How can God judge me and take care of me at the same time? And yet, we do that with our kids, don't we? When you send them to their rooms, when you take their toys away, when you ground them, does that mean that you've withdrawn your care and your love from your child? That you're no longer going to feed them and take care of them? I think that we see an example of this in the life of David. That he's being judged, but we see God taking care of him in that judgment. Why? Because David is still continuing to walk with God. As hobbled as that walk might be, he's doing what Saul didn't do. He's continuing to walk with God, to get up, to keep going, and to trust God throughout this process. And I think we got to keep in mind the same can happen to me. That maybe I'm being chastised by the Lord, maybe God's judgment comes into my life, but understand that if you respond the right way, and David wasn't perfect, but following his example, if we respond the right way and are repentant and humbled, that even in judgment, God will take care of you. He will provide the things that you need to get through that period of your life, and he won't abandon you so long as you don't abandon him. So that's the big thing that I take away from that section. Any other comments or questions as we end? Thank you for letting me go a couple minutes over. But any other comments or questions, thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Larry.
My son may be proud but I still be in the kitchen cooking dinner.
Yeah. And I'm learning as a parent how much I don't enjoy punishing little Layla, right? So I don't think that's something God enjoys either. But any other thoughts? All right. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. We'll pick up next week in chapter 17.